Hello,
Hey Costa, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Fine, fine. I mean, the weather is amazing here. I'm in Budapest at the moment, actually. So,
That's nice.
yeah,
Yeah, welcome. We're super happy to have you here today. We're just gonna wait like 30 seconds to a minute so some more people can join in, and I'll just do an intro in Bulgarian for a second, and then we'll switch back to English.
okay.
Yes. Здравейте
You
на
hear me?
всички отново. Yes.
Bro?
Здравейте на всички отново. Благодарим ви, че се включвате днес с нас на OutBG. Подготвили сме ви едно много специално интервю с политолога и активист Реми Бони, който сега ще се представи на английски. И той ще ни разкаже за ситуацията в Полша в момента, където има доста сериозно организирано насилие срещу ЛГБТИ и общността от новото старо правителство и той ще ни разкаже малко повече. Ако междувременно имате въпроси, може да ги оставите в коментарите и ние ще ви отговорим. And now we're switching back to English. I'd like to welcome Remy here, who is an amazing political scientist and LGBTQ activist working around Europe. And I'm going to let you say a little bit more about the work you do and specifically the region you focus on.
Yes, okay. So thank you for inviting me, Costa. I'm also very happy that you invited me, actually. I think the project, oh, it's Bulgaria, it's a very nice project, and it's really, as I already told you, the next step, important step also, the establishment of more equality for the LGBTI community in Bulgaria. That's what we see from Western Europe, that's what we saw in other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. So me, about myself, as you were briefly already saying, in Bulgarian, I guess, because I understand just in a few words at least. I'm a political scientist from Belgium. And yes, so I work mainly on LGBTI politics on a European level. And because of the situation that we have at this moment in Central and Eastern Europe, where the LGBTI community is very much the front line of defending democracy, defending rule of law. My main focus area at the moment is also Central and Eastern Europe. Over the last years, I have been leading a lot of research into Russian interference in the anti-LGBTI and anti-gender movements. That's maybe something that we can also talk on later on. And of course, a lot of my work is just monitoring the movements of the anti-LGBTI movement in the region. And that's also why I was last week also in Poland. And now when I'm in Hungary to do the same. The situation that we had in Poland last week and is very, very worrisome, of course, as well. I'm also currently founding a new watchdog to more structurally monitor the movements of the anti-LGBTI movement. It's going to be called the European Coalition for LGBTI Security and Equality. That's basically what I'm working on.
That's amazing. That sounds like a great new initiative, one that will be very happy to help and to monitor and to be part of it as well. So before we jump into Poland and Hungary, can you talk a little bit about the international aspects of your work and why is it important to look at trends throughout the whole European region rather than looking at every country individually?
Yes. So what I was also saying at the beginning, of course, my work my research on the interference of Russia within the anti-LGBTI movement is one part of what I have been doing. And that's mainly because we see that in Central and Eastern Europe, but actually to the wider extent of the whole European Union, we see the same things happening in every single country. We see the attacks on gender studies in Romania, something that also happened in Hungary a few years ago. You have the same kind of narratives happening in Poland, Slovakia, and so on. We had the transgender ban in Hungary, same few months later in Russia, and so on. So it's very, very clear that all these kind of things are not isolated from each other. The people, the conservative, the ultra-conservative people who are actually fighting against the LGBTI community often use the same rhetoric, the same wording, basically. So we know that there is a real international dimension to the work of the international anti-LGBTI movement. And one part of my research, for instance, one of these organizations I'm monitoring is called the World Congress of Families. World Congress of Families is officially an American-based organization, an ultra-conservative evangelical American organization based in Washington, and also doing a lot of lobbying at the UN level. But if we look to who is actually in the board there you see that there's a lot of Hungarian state secretaries are involved. You have people from Serbia in there. You have Russian oligarchs close to the Kremlin in there. So it's really a big international, the anti-LGBTI movement has a big international dimension. It's very hierarchical. It's literally what we see happening in Poland with LGBTI-free zones, what we see happening in Hungary with the transgender ban. That's all things that are being decided from above the national level. So that's also important, why it is important to focus on the international dimension.
So you're saying that we're looking at kind of a trained intelligence web of international...
Yes. What we see, for instance, in Russia, the people from Russia who are in there are people close to Kremlin, are intelligence organizations. One of the organizations that is directly supporting the Hungarian State Secretary for Family Affairs in her fight against the LGBTI movement is the Russian Institute for Strategic Studies. Russian Institute for Strategic Studies is the same institute who has, in Bulgaria, for instance, who has interfered in the elections in Bulgaria, who has made a draw of the plan to interfere in the American presidential elections. The leader of the organization has orchestrated an attempt for a coup d'etat and Montenegro a few years ago. So it's an intelligence organization, and these are the kind of people who are supporting the anti-LGBTI movement. So don't underestimate them. It's not just about religion or ideology, it's about geopolitics. It's about the fight between Europe and Russia. And that's what it's really about, actually.
Right, that was going to be my next question. How do you see LGBTQ, like gender and sexuality politics, fitting in the overall picture of what is the ideology that they're trying to convey?
Yes, so I mean, as I was already saying before, actually, what we've seen in Central and Eastern Europe is that the LGBTI community, and especially the LGBTI movement, has been put inside and the front line of the fight between Russia and Brussels, between liberalism and illiberalism, between autocracy and democracy. So this whole fight, this whole populist fight that we see happening in Central and Eastern Europe, that's where at this moment the LGBTI community is in the front line. So we are the ones, if we want it or not, but we are the ones who actually are defending liberal democracy and the European Union at the moment. And that's a thought that we really have to also within ourselves have to accept, because it's for a lot of politicians in Brussels and the European Union are currently watching us. They're waiting for us to respond, to be more activistic. I had a meeting 2 weeks ago with somebody inside the European Commission. Now we were discussing the strategies of the LGBTI movement in Europe. And she was literally telling me at some point, you know, this LGBTI organization on the European level, I mean, they're doing nice work and so on, but they are so diplomatic. They are more diplomatic than a lot of politicians at the moment. So we should stop being diplomatic anymore and start being real activists again, and not just activists for LGBTI rights, but I mean, these attacks on rule of law and Poland and Hungary, these are attacks also on our rights.
Absolutely.
It's because of the decline of rule of law that we have 48 people, LGBTI people, detained in Poland last weekend. And yeah, so that's really a thought that we also need to convince ourselves of.
That's a really great way of putting it, because oftentimes when we have this conversation, we say that the LGBTQ community is becoming a scapegoat to this political tug of war between Europe and Russia. But actually, the way you framed it, if we're looking at ourselves as people who are fighting for liberal democracy and can kind of set a precedent and be at the forefront, that's a much more powerful and positive way of looking at the interaction that's going on. So thank you for that. And I think now is the time to give us a little bit of an update on Poland. Maybe first what was happening before the election, so we have some background, and then you can speak about the things from last week as well.
So you need to know Polish politics. It's basically always, especially since 2015, 2014, when the Law and Justice government won the election. The Law and Justice is actually a very, I mean, I would call them right-wing conservatives. They are not far right because there is even more far right party in Poland. So yeah, they're kind of far right, but not that far right yet. And already with their elections in 2015, they always try to scapegoat a certain minority. And with scapegoating a certain minority in 2015, they were focusing on Muslim migrants, the possible influx of Muslim migrants. Well, I mean, in practice, no Muslim migrant came to Poland, because why would they? So they kind of had to find a new scapegoat for winning the following elections. And what we immediately saw in Poland is that they easily found the LGBTI community as a new scapegoat, and that was strategically for them a very smart move, because at that point, if you want to materialize your scapegoating, your attacks on certain minority, you want to show them that it's really a danger. Well, you need to find some minority which is actually visible in your country.
Right.
Yeah, and what we saw in the last 5 years is that the LGBTI community in Poland has gained a lot of strength. It organizes huge pride parades. The pride parade in Warsaw often attracts more than 50,000 people. The LGBTI nightlife scene in all the bigger cities is very wide, it's very well organized, and so on. So there was also one of the biggest opposition leaders in Poland is also an openly homosexual man.
Right.
So the LGBTI community is very, very visible in Poland, and of course, that's where the scapegoating started. And then before the election campaign, there was already a lot going on, with a lot of ministers making very homophobic and transphobic comments. There was also a lot of local entities, cities, regions, provinces declaring themselves LGBTI-free zones. What that means in practice is not always that clear. We know that, for instance, one of the practicalities of those things is that civil society cannot apply for project funding anymore if they somehow defend the rights of sexual and gender minorities. So this kind of things were already happening during the election, before the election campaign. Poland has had a very homophobic and transphobic rhetoric over the last 3 or 4 years, I would say. Then during the last election campaign, you immediately had the president of Poland, who is now re-elected, saying that the LGBTI ideology is more harmful than communism. And so there were a lot of problems, of course, with that single quote. First of all, referring to the LGBTI community as an ideology, literally dehumanizing a whole community within your country, dehumanizing your own citizens, and then comparing it to communism. I mean, same as in Bulgaria. I mean, the history of communism of Poland is not like that good, and especially the symbolism of the comment was very, very strong, because he said it like a few hours before he wasn't going to do an official visit to Auschwitz-Birkenau. So first he says that LGBTI is more harmful to communism, and then he visits Auschwitz-Birkenau. So the symbolism of this whole thing was immense, and it was really shocking. And then he also announced that he was going to change the constitution and put some anti-LGBTI laws inside the constitution and so on. So the shock was big. But at that point, I mean, this was a very, very bad. Of course, if you imagine growing up as a teenager, discovering your sexuality or gender identity, that's very bad to hear. But we were like, okay, this is going to be mainly electoral rhetoric, but apparently it was not just election talk. 2 days after the re-election of Duda, the first activist was detained.
Right.
Yeah. And then we had other activists detained last week during because of the fact that they were actually they were detained because they had made a picture they had a photo up basically with a rainbow flag in front of a statue of Jesus Christ. And
Right.
because of that, they were detained. They were detained on the grounds of desecration and blasphemy, and not on the grounds of vandalism and so on, because there was no vandalism. They had some duct tape, so they put like the rainbow flag with some duct tape on the statue, and took a picture, and afterwards they took the flag off again.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, this is the European Union. People getting detained on the grounds of desecration. That's crazy for me. And again, there was at that point there was no reaction of the European Union on that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, after 48 hours, the people who were being detained were released. But then earlier last week on Friday, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we received a call and we heard that one of those activists was going to be detained for 2 months, awaiting her trial. And that was the moment that we immediately said, like, these activists has to come over to the headquarters of KPH, the Campaign Against Homophobia, the biggest LGBTI organization in Poland. And yeah, that's also at that moment KPH put it on social media. She was going to be there. Many people started coming to the headquarters of the organization, and basically started to form a human shield around the organization, so the police couldn't detain it. And at some point, around 300 people were in front of the office. The police arrived, totally underestimating the amount of people who were going to be there. There were like 6 police officers. Then the LGBTI activist Margot showed up, and she said, like, okay, if you want, you can detain me. Police said, like, yeah, but we are not going to detain you with 300 people who want to basically knock us down. So the police left, and then the activists decided to go to the main street of Warsaw. And there, when they arrived there, 300 police officers were waiting for them.
Crazy.
Yeah, that was crazy. When Margot arrived in the streets, Margot was immediately put in a police car. What the reaction then was quite obvious. There was several, like a few tens of activists, LGBT activists, basically jumped on the car, preventing it from moving away. That game went on for an hour, and after an hour, the police started an offensive, taking away all the people blocking the car. And at that point, I mean, legally speaking, I don't say I agree with it, but legally speaking, the police, of course, had then could intervene up to then. They can take people with force that are preventing a detention from happening. But that's not where it ended. I mean, they started taking away people who were preventing a detention with force, but they were also starting to detain and beat people who were just standing on the sidewalks. At that point, there were like a few hundred activists, but not just activists, also journalists, members of the opposition members of parliament, who were coming together on the same place just to monitor, to see what was happening. Already at that moment, TVN, the biggest commercial TV channel, was live broadcasting during prime time the whole thing that was happening. They were having breaking news all over the country about what is happening, and literally on national television, the people saw the police knocking down, detaining peaceful protesters. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to make the comparison because it's on another scale, but that's what we have seen yesterday in Belarus as well.
Yes,
Belarus, yeah, it's the same kind of image. I mean, the people who are watching can Google afterwards. It's the same kind of image that we saw happening in Belarus, we saw happening in Poland, the biggest Central European member state of the European Union, and there is no reaction coming from the European Union still. There has been no reaction in Belarus, but no reaction on what's happened in Poland. And I've been in contact with people inside the European Commission all morning, and I'm literally on a war with them at the moment. Because, yeah, they're just making pragmatic considerations.
Right.
The Europe,
Which have
at this moment,
no real power at this point.
No, I mean, what they are telling me, it's difficult for us because we want Poland to vote for the multi-annual financial framework, which is the long-term budget, and Poland is literally threatening them to vote the whole budget down for the whole European Union for the coming 5 years. So we don't want to start an open war, but I mean, the Polish authorities started an open war themselves last weekend.
Absolutely.
They detained 48 peaceful activists. 48 peaceful activists. And as long as the European Union is going, I mean, they're literally digging their own grave at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they are doing.
Absolutely.
A Europe without values is, in my opinion, not the name Union worthy anymore. Sorry, but I don't see a reason anymore for a Europe who allows Russian procedures happening on its own citizens. Sorry, but if that's the way that we are going, I'm going to be as Europhobic probably as a Brexiteer as well.
Actually, yes, we saw some very small responses last week, right, when they cut the funding of some Polish cities who declared themselves LGBT-free zones, but it was more of a message and not really anything.
Yeah, that's pure symbolism. I mean, the maximum we're speaking about a subsidy of a maximum of 25,000 euros.
Right,
that's
which
peanuts.
It's not.
It's peanuts. Do you know what the reaction of the Polish government was on that? Well, if Europe doesn't pay, we're gonna give the money to these cities.
Yes.
So,
and the police brutality you mentioned actually hits home a lot with Bulgaria right now. I don't know if I've told you, but now we're in a month of anti-government protests. We've been calling the whole government to resign, and we've seen the same types of tactics with, police escalating violence and having a lot of provokers, and just not the way things should be going in the European Union. It's a different topic, but the same type of reactions, and we're seeing.
Yes, you're totally right. I mean, we've seen indeed what was happening in Bulgaria as well. We've seen, not to the same extent with police brutality, but we see also what is happening in Hungary and so on. I mean, that's also why I immediately called for an extraordinary European Council of the heads of states. Because, sorry, but if we do allow this is the end of the European Union, in my opinion. We can all survive an economic crisis, and a thing like Brexit is hard. But if there is no European ID anymore, no European values anymore, I don't know why we should still exist. I mean, me as a Western taxpayer, I find it very hard actually to know that my money is flowing to people who are establishing LGBTI-free zones.
Absolutely.
And I mean, and I'm a bit too diplomatic to do that already now, but at some point I'm going to be severely disobedient on them, because sorry, but I cannot accept there are around 15 million LGBTI citizens inside the European Union paying for LGBTI free zones.
That's crazy.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Acceptable. Yeah. Absolutely. So what do you think the international community and individuals can help support what's going on in Poland right now? Where can we show and raise our concern?
The first thing that we always have to do, of course, is raising attention. Well, I mean, there has been a lot of media attention on what happened last week in Poland, but it could have been more, honestly. I was just talking with somebody from BBC. BBC didn't write one story about what happened last weekend in Poland. So there is still a lot to do about raising attention. What people can do, for instance, is organizing solidarity protests with the people in Poland. Yesterday there was a solidarity protest in Berlin and one in Prague. Tomorrow there's going to be one in Budapest as well. So I really encourage also the people in Sofia to start organizing solidarity protests with the people in Poland in front of the Polish embassy in Sofia. So that's one thing, of course, that you can do, and also convince your own politicians to do something against this, because in the end they are all meeting with each other inside the European Council. So if Bulgaria takes the side of the Western European countries, which is the right side of history, in my opinion.
Absolutely. That's our fight here as well with our new media, to be that voice and to demand that change.
Yes, so yeah, mainly it's about attention raising that needs to be done. The LGBTI community in Poland has financially quite a lot of resources. That's not the biggest deal at the moment. Right. They're very well organized, so they can speak for themselves. But it's also this attention raising on a European level and all European member states at the moment. That still needs to happen.
That sounds great. And this is kind of it's a side question, but it's related also. How have you seen the pandemic shift what's going on in terms of LGBT rights? I know in times of crisis, a lot of politicians will use the convenience and the uncertainty to, push new legislation and to try to change things while people are preoccupied with the bigger crisis. So what have you seen and what should we be watching out for?
Yeah, so to some extent, I was at some point I was literally thinking that the ultra conservatives knew that there was going to be a pandemic, because they were so well organized during the pandemic. The things that they established and that they got during the pandemic, it's crazy. We were all overwhelmed about what was happening, and they actually pushed through legislation, anti-LGBT legislation. A lot of countries who, Poland and Hungary, for instance, who de-ratified the Istanbul Convention.
Right.
Hungary, introducing a law banning any legal gender changes, which makes the legal situation for transgender and intersex people in Hungary worse than in Russia or Azerbaijan, for instance. So you saw that during the pandemic, all these ultra-conservative forces were actually abusing the attention that was going to the COVID-19 to introduce these medieval policies.
Yes. Yeah. So they were very well organized during the time.
Yeah, and then we're not even talking anymore. Not any talking still about the psychological impacts on LGBTI people of the COVID-19 crisis. We had somebody who put herself on fire in front of the Prime Minister's office, a transgender person in Georgia, for instance, because the transgender community who often relies on sex work in a country like Georgia.
Right.
They were desperate. They didn't have any money. They didn't have any food anymore, and there was no help coming from any government. So that's the kind of situation that we were in. Legally speaking, a lot changed, but psychologically speaking, a pandemic was extraordinary impactful in a negative way on the LGBTI community.
Absolutely, especially for minors and people who were sheltered with unfriendly family.
And also, if we're talking about same-sex couples, for instance, an international same-sex couple, somebody who has a husband in Belgium, but is from Poland, so a Polish-Belgian couple, they were just not able to meet with each other anymore.
Yes.
So the Belgian husband could not go to Poland just because the Polish government was not recognizing their relationship, so they could not see each other for many months. So also these practical consequences were immense on the LGBTI community during COVID-19.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack and to think while we're talking about these global and transnational trends, to always think of the personal and the human side of it as well. And that's something that we'll keep sharing and kind of giving those stories power as well, because we believe it's really important to, we think the personal can also be powerful in shifting attitudes as well as looking at the region as a whole. Thank you for the enlightening interview and for everything you mentioned. There's a lot to address and a lot to unpack, definitely.
Yes. Yes, thank you for inviting me, Costa, and good luck with the project. I really think that you're doing a great job with it.
Thank you so much, and we're always here for any updates you want to share with your work. And thank you on behalf of the Bulgarian LGBTQ community for doing the work you do. I think it's super important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you the same. Bye-bye.
Bye.